Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. As always, we're happy to have you with us. So today we're continuing our tour examining all the teams who might be part of the 12-team playoff. We've already covered the ACC, Big 12, and the Big 10, so be sure to check out those previous episodes if you haven't already. And today, we're going to take a moment to dissect some of those lovable teams in the group of five. Starting this season, at least one G5 conference champ will be in the college football playoff, so we're going to review some of the top candidates right now in June. Before we dive in, though, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Please take a moment, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. So this should be a fun show. There's a group of five candidates. So just to quickly remind everyone about this new 12-team playoff structure, it's a 5+7 model where the top five conference champs plus 7 at-large teams will create the 12-team playoff field. Among the 5 conference champs, the highest-ranked 4 teams of those 5 conferences will be the top 4 seeds in the CFB playoff bracket and get first-round byes. The assumption is the vast majority of years, the strength of the P4 will assure that those 4 seeds will be the Big 10, SEC, Big 12, and ACC champs. But once in a while, there could be a G5 champ that could break in and be one of those top 4 seeds. Cincy proved it's possible several years ago. But for the most part, they will probably be the 12th seed and not get that first round bye. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Our format, well, let's go over our format. Sean, you've always been kind of breaking it down for us. First of all, how are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, it's been it was my first Father's Day on Sunday, so that was a lot of fun. Got to enjoy that with the family. So what we're going to do is we have a list of 9 candidates from the group of 5 who we consider to be the top playoff contenders out of the group of 5. Now, only one, of course, will most likely make the field. And when we eventually get to our group of 12 teams that are in our contending category, we're probably only going to have 1 or maybe 2 group of 5 teams at a time. But what we're going to do is we're going to take the 9. They're from basically all of the different conferences. I think we actually do hit on every single group of 5 conference, and we are going to rank them 1 through 9. And we're going to do it as we go, right? So, hey, we'll hit on Memphis. Maybe we have them as like our top team right now, but then, maybe you throw in Liberty or maybe you throw in UTSA and we'll move teams up and down the list and kind of end up at the end. Basically, we'll kind of approach it like this team goes above these teams, this team goes below these teams. So it gives us an opportunity to hit on all of them. And again, one of the parts of this exercise as we go through each of the conferences is to come up with our list of teams under contention for our 12 whenever we handle the season, right? When the 12 teams who are in the college football playoff conversation, this is a way for us to do that with the group of 5 as well. So the 9 teams, and we'll go through them and maybe not in this order. Memphis, Boise State, Liberty. So that's AAC, Mountain West, Conference USA. App State from the Sun Belt. Tulane and UTSA, also from the AAC. Toledo from the MAC. South Florida, also from the AAC. And Fresno State from the Mountain West. So a collection of teams from across the conferences. And look, this is the first time we're going to have this kind of race exactly for a spot in the college football playoff. We've seen it before with of course the race for the New Year's Six, and different criteria applies in some ways than to just make the playoff. Of course, you have to be a conference champion to really be under consideration because it's the top 5 conference champions. That means that the independent teams can't actually make it unless they finish as a top 11 team in the country. The other piece too, though, is that look, in other conferences, if you are contending for the conference, that makes you a playoff contender. That's not necessarily the case in the group of 5. You can't just be a conference championship contender. You have to be a contender to be the top conference champion of the group. And another piece I'm going to be fascinated by long term is, do we start seeing maybe upsets in these conference championship games, and how much are they going to completely throw the entire situation out of whack? I mean, last year we saw it. Liberty makes the New Year's Six as the top Conference USA champion because SMU upsets Tulane in the AAC championship game. So a lot of moving pieces. I think the last thing I'll say on this is that when I look at the group of five right now, I mean, last year we had a team from Conference USA make the New Year's Six and would have made the college football playoff had it existed. I think that we are moving away from the AAC just having a stranglehold on the rest of the sport. And I really think that there will be contenders from every one of the group of five conferences heading forward to make the college football playoff.
I absolutely agree with you. This is going to be a really interesting G5 race. When I was putting together my thoughts on these teams, as well as just looking at each conference, there's a couple of these conferences where there's surprising candidates. I was surprised. I mean, we have several representatives from the American, but then when I really started breaking down the Mountain West, I was like, there's some dark horses here, and we'll get to them in probably our next episode. But heading into these candidates, why don't we kick it off with Memphis? I think they're a good place to sort of start. Now, last season they had a great year, 10-3, 6-2 in the American. They just sort of were in the shadow of Tulane and SMU. They won the Liberty Bowl. And their losses, they had 3 losses, but they were respectable losses. Again, they lost to Tulane and SMU, but they lost to Mizzou, which ended up being a much better team than I think anyone realized, especially at the time they played. Ryan Silverfield is in his 5th season. I believe he is one of those coaches that we don't hear about enough. That was said, I think, quite a bit at the end of last season, but certainly needs to be underlined because what they have going there. I know you're a fan of the quarterback, Seth Hennigan. The only thing I have to say, my reserve about their team is all their tough teams are on the road. I mean, if you look at their schedule, playing at Florida State, even at home would have been tough. But playing, going to Tallahassee, that's going to be a tough one on September 14th. But then they play at UTSA, at Tulane, and at a team we're going to probably get to with South Florida. So those are all games on the road. If the Tigers can, and again, the one thing, and I just want to emphasize for our listeners, this is finally, we don't have to worry necessarily about a G5 team dropping an early season game against a tough P4 opponent. Because that was always the thing. You'd see a team, it's like, yeah, too bad they lost to like top 10 Oklahoma. And you'd be like, that stinks for that team. I mean, they could still be quite good. But here, dropping that, if they drop a game at Florida State, they're still going to be in the race to be that 5th champion. But I mean, it's interesting to look at this, and I don't know. I'm curious where we should place them. But what are your thoughts on Memphis?
Well, I think for me, they're still really hard to evaluate as a team because, you look at them last year, they of course win 10 games for the first time under Ryan Silverfield, but you also, I mean, it's hard not to kind of sit here and be like, what did they actually do? They played Missouri really close. That was actually very impressive in hindsight. They beat Boise State, but it was kind of a reeling Boise State who ended up firing their coach at the time. Lost to Tulane, lost to SMU. And then they did beat Iowa State in the bowl game. Like, that is definitely not nothing. We obviously are very high on Iowa State on this program. But, like, what's your next favorite win that they had, right? Like, is it, I mean, Boise State's up there, I guess. Like, South Florida, they ended up outlasting 59-50. That is a team that we'll talk about. But, like, I don't know. Like, I don't feel like they won that many impressive games. Like the Iowa State game is probably their most impressive win of the season. And it's a bowl game. You just don't know how much stock to put into something like that. And so heading into 2024, I like the fact that they have a quarterback returning. I like the fact that they have some decent production returning. One thing to keep an eye on long term with this program is they have basically built a partnership with FedEx that seems like it's going to be able to keep some players in town from an NIL perspective. And I think you have to feel real good about that. Brock Taylor's back at receiver. He's a big time player, but of course, they're the first team, so we're just going to put them right kind of smack dab in the middle of the board. The Memphis will kind of be our guiding line for where to slot teams. But I think from my perspective, I view them as I view them as maybe upper middle class in this group. Like, if I had to slot them right now without looking at any of the other teams so far, I'd have them probably like 4, I'd say, on my list. A team that I think has the upside to get to that final group, but I don't necessarily know what to expect at the same time.
It is interesting. I'm thinking of like, can they use that not only retain players, but can they use FedEx to deliver them some players overnight? That's what I'm wondering. When your transfer arrival has to absolutely positively get there, which is a reference to a very, very old FedEx commercial that I don't think you're necessarily going to get. So moving on, the other team, to kind of throw out there, and again, I'm having trouble placing them, is Boise State, because last season was a strange season for Boise State. They started with Andy Avalos for 10 games, and then they switched to Spencer Danielson for the final 3. They managed to win the Mountain West in an 8-6 overall record, but importantly, 6-2 in the Mountain West. They lost the LA Bowl to UCLA. They decided to put the permanent tag on Spencer Danielson. And then the offensive coordinator is now going to be Dirk Cotter. Now, I have a lot of respect for Dirk Cotter, because some people, when I was really getting into college football, he made the switch. He had been at Boise State. I remember when he was at Boise State. He was there for 3 seasons. He actually succeeded Houston Nutt, which is really funny to think that Houston Nutt was the coach there. But he had 2 10-win seasons, which set up the Boise State that we saw climb up with Dan Hawkins, who was Cotter's offensive coordinator. And then when Hawkins took Colorado, his offensive coordinator, Chris Peterson, took the Broncos and ran with them. So it's good to see him back there. He knows he's been there obviously for a few seasons, kind of in the background, but it's good to see him rise up to be the offensive coordinator. They lost Talon Green to Arkansas, but then they brought Malachi Nelson from USC. Obviously, Nelson was a highly touted quarterback that Lincoln Riley brought in. He had a little bit of an injury. Some were saying he wasn't quite where he is, but there's still talent there, and certainly Boise State can do something with them. They have the reigning Mountain West Player of the Year with that running back who had almost 2,000 yards and 20 touchdowns, probably 19 touchdowns, almost 20. Everything's almost a 2 for him. The problem is they have a defense that needs some repairs. So looking at their schedule, they actually have the funny thing is they host the Pac-2. And they host them both. There's no road games. Wazoo and Oregon State are heading to Boise to play on the Smurf turf. The tough thing is they play at Oregon. That's going to be a toughie. Actually, and to be fair, their opener is at Georgia Southern. And Statesboro is not a friendly place to play a football game. They love that team down there. I always tell folks, because they moved up from FCS, like they moved up with their rival, their frenemy, App State. Those are 2 teams that really, when they were at FCS, that was like going to play. They took that game at a level that was not an afterthought. It's like Montana. It's like one of those programs where people were really serious about it. So that's going to be a tough environment. But then their conference schedule isn't bad. They don't play Air Force. They don't play Fresno State or Colorado State. They play San Diego State at home, but it's Sean Lewis. It would be very interesting to see where the Aztecs go, but it might be a little early for that. So they're an interesting program. I am not sure where to place them either, because their slate at home, their slate in conference should be good, but their non-conference could get hairy.
So I have them very high on my list. I do. I think that for me, they are either 1 or 2. So we'll put them above the Memphis line, personally. The thing for me, right? So obviously they're going to lose at Oregon, whatever. Like I'll live with that. I think that once you get into conference play, they do go to UNLV, who is replacing Jaden Mayava, but a really good team last year, has a decent amount of returning production. I don't think there's a lot else that scares you. The fact that Washington State and Oregon State basically lost all of their good players, which just sucks, by the way, but like I think that it makes it a little more manageable. Actually, if you look at ESPN's SP Plus, Boise State out of the group of 5 has the 3rd best odds to go 11-1 or better, with a 12% chance. And the 2 teams in front of them, Liberty, who we'll get to, and James Madison, who's ineligible for the playoff because they're still transitioning, both have schedules that rank 128th or worse. Boise State is 77th. Like, that is a way better group of 5 schedule than a lot of these other teams will play, and still there's optimism about how they'll handle it. A couple other pieces I like. You mentioned Ashton Jeanty back at running back. He is one of the best players in the entire country. Like he might be a top 5 running back in the entire country, both as a rusher and as a pass catcher, by the way, which I love. They bring in Malachi Nelson. We'll kind of see what he is at quarterback, but I think that certainly from a talent perspective, there's upside. The piece that I love is that they are number 5 in returning defensive production nationally. So, yes, it wasn't an elite defense last year by any means, but I don't think that that means that they won't be a good defense this year. And actually, the other piece I'll point out as well is if you look at their last half of the season, they gave up to 37. They gave up 37 to Fresno State on November 4th, but starting October 28th, it was 7, 37, 14, 10, 19, 20. And by the way, that includes games against UNLV, Air Force, and Wyoming, who were all really good last year. So I do think that they started to figure some stuff out when Spencer Danielson took over that defense, took over the team, but was able to emphasize his defense in a lot of ways. And so I think that this is a team that's on my short list for number 1.
Yeah, I think that schedule certainly gives them that extra oomph. When you consider that, especially the conference schedule, they have a real opportunity to climb up. And speaking of schedules, our friends from last season, the kings of playing a schedule that may not be the toughest in the universe, the Liberty Flames. And again, to Liberty's credit, it's not like they aren't trying to schedule these games. It just no one really wants to play them because they see it as almost a no-win situation with a team that spends the way they do on trying to be basically a P4 talent in a G5 conference. So we all know how it went last season. They went undefeated in the regular season in their conference championship game and then got absolutely pantsed by Oregon in the Fiesta Bowl. Jamie Chadwell is a very talented coach. A couple of years ago, we were all surprised to see that the first team to give him a chance out of Coastal Carolina was Liberty. A lot of folks thought he might have an opportunity to go to more of a traditional P4 program. Their schedule is slightly, I think you could say, better than last season. But again, the highlight of their non-conference is going to play at App State, a contender in the Sun Belt. Their conference, I mean, when you're looking at their conference schedule, like what team could possibly challenge them? And you kind of look at Rich Rod's Jacksonville State program. That'll be a home game for the Flames on October 30th. Caden Salter's back. That is tremendous. I was surprised to see the quarterback return there because he is a good quarterback. One of the things I just want to point out, though, I do get a kick out of the fact that the offensive coordinator is Willie Korn, who, of course, I remember when he was at Clemson, it didn't work out. He went to Marshall, didn't work out. He went to North Greenville, a D2 team, which, by the way, was where Jamie Chadwell was coaching at the time. So I always think that's one of my cutest sort of like, oh, where's that offensive coordinator and head coach, their relationship, just to kind of look at that. But Liberty's such an oddball. Where do we place them? I mean, because if we're thinking about like realistically teams that could just run the whole schedule, last season they weren't a surprise. Everyone thought, oh yeah, Liberty could win it all. And then the rest of the G5 beat each other up so badly that no other team could challenge them. I mean, arguably, SMU could have been that team, but the College Football Playoff Committee didn't see it that way. Is that where their role is again this season? Are we just going to say like they're our default answer if everyone else screws up, it's going to be Liberty again?
I think there's a very good chance of that, right? Because look, they will have a truly signature win on their schedule with Appalachian State, who is most likely going to be the team from the Sun Belt contending for the playoff spot. So I think that does give them like half a step up. But the other piece is that New Mexico State was that 10-win team last year and went and beat Auburn. So like it kind of evened itself out in that way. I do think that Liberty cannot afford to lose a single game. Like I think that losing even one game would be killer for this team. And a piece to point at as well is that I think when you look at the group of 5 in 2023, like you said, a lot of teams screwed up. Tulane lost in their conference championship game. That ended up being a killer for them. The Mountain West really beat themselves up. They didn't have a true champion kind of come out of it. The Sun Belt, Troy, I think, had some issues. They lost some early games, and that just kind of cost them down the stretch. I don't think that's going to be the case this year. I think that there are too many quality teams in the group of 5 who have a chance to have a 10 or 11 or 12 win season, that I don't see Liberty as being especially likely to come out this year. And the other thing too is that it's really hard to replicate perfection. All right, they went 13-0 last year to make the New Year's Six, and again, it's hard to find exactly what that loss is. At Appalachian State is easily the most likely. Jacksonville State, that's kind of a tricky game. Western Kentucky is always pretty tough. East Carolina is not a nobody in the non-conference, although they are not in the best position that they've ever been as a program. And in week 2, they do travel to New Mexico State to play a really late game. That's going to be a 10-15 body clock for them. So maybe that ends up getting a little squirrely. And by the way, if you're New Mexico State, I'm sure you'd love to have that game after losing 2 to them last season. So I think this is a 12-1 team that the playoff committee is going to be trying to find a way to get themselves out of. So I think that right now I'd have them ahead of Memphis, but I would not have them ahead of Boise State.
No, I agree with that kind of ranking. With Liberty, to be fair, I think they're the biggest chance for a New Year's Six rematch is actually the idea of Oregon going to the Big Ten title game, losing a squeaker to Ohio State, ending up the 5 seed, and then Liberty strolls in as a 12 seed, and boom! This year they get to play in Austin.
By the way, the playoff committee has to be hoping that that Texas has a great year, because if Oregon makes the playoff field at number 5, they are extremely likely to either rematch Liberty, a rematch of last year, or rematch Boise State, which would be a rematch of this year. So if you're the playoff committee, you got to be hoping that you can find a way to get them up to number 6.
Oh my goodness. And I mean, I'm only imagining the memes that have come out of an Oregon Liberty rematch. It would be like, didn't learn your lesson, old man. Like, why won't you just die or whatever? Like, I can't even. Like, Liberty's going to end up being like Rocky. I didn't hear no bell. And like climb back into the ring, in the fourth quarter down 77-0 or something. I can't even imagine. I mean, who knows? We'll see. We'll see how the Flames look. They could improve by all intents. But, moving on, we're actually just talking about their non-conference opponent. Why don't we switch over to one of the contenders in the Sun Belt, App State. So Appalachian State, Mountaineers, last season was really a confusing team to watch. So they went 9-5, 6-2 in the conference. Sean Lewis, not Sean Lewis.
Sean Clark.
Yeah, Sean Clark. Sorry. That fan base has a love-hate relationship with him because, again, from my other side of college football stuff is I moderate a very large forum, and watching the App State fans absolutely lose their mind after some of those losses was something else. And they lost in the title. They made it to the title game. They lost to Troy, which is going to be weaker this season because, again, we'll probably talk about John Morrell's new team. They were able to go to the Cure Bowl and take out a solid MAC team in Miami. They've got a return of Joey Aguilar. He started 12 games. He placed 3rd in college football in total yards last season, set a bunch of school records in the process. They have a very interesting non-conference schedule. They go at Clemson and they go to Liberty, which they host Liberty, which we've talked about. That should actually be a great game, just for the record. I mean, we've talked about it before, but that is going to be a fantastic game. But then they also host.
We'll be watching.
They host James Madison. So again, one of the other technically not a Sun Belt contender because, as you mentioned, they can't actually be in the college football playoff because they're stupid. Well, that's all I'll say about that. The playoff committee there, and then they're going to be finishing at that frenemy rivalry, Georgia Southern, which I'm not sure where Georgia Southern is going to be this season, but you can't discount the rivalry there. I mean, I actually looked it up because I'm like, they have to have a name for it. Deeper Than Hate. Like, what? They're going off the rails with some of these. But again, those two teams have a history in the FCS of being rivals. I mean, they were conference rivals, I believe, in the SoCon for a while. But just in terms of competing with each other to be the FCS champion for quite some years. App State's a weird one. I'm not sure where to place them. I want to place them lower than some of the others, but what do you think?
They're tough for me. So one thing to mention, this is the only Sunbelt team that we're talking about. It's not because there are not other quality Sunbelt teams. It's because one, maybe the best team in the Sunbelt could be James Madison. I think they're going to take a step back. I don't think they're going to be quite as good as last year, but like they wouldn't be eligible anyway. And you look at so many of the other really good teams in the Sun Belt, Troy, South Alabama, right? Like you're talking about programs that are turning over coaching staffs, and we don't really know what to expect from them. And James Madison, by the way, also doing that with Bob Chesney coming in, the former coach at Holy Cross, taking over for Kurt Signetti. So it's just like a weird transitionary year in the Sun Belt, and I think that when there's transition, you sometimes just have to lean on what you know. It's funny, right? We obviously talked about Ryan Silverfield in Memphis previously, and these two programs are so they're not linked, but like vibe wise, they just color this so similarly to me because they're both programs that are very proud, that play a certain way, that hired, actually ironically, an offensive line coach at both places to take over and try to maintain successful programs. And in both cases, they've done it fine. Not necessarily great, not necessarily to the level that maybe fans deservedly think that the program should be achieving, but fine. And I think that this is a big year for Sean Clark to kind of say, well, in the absence of an external power, we can be that team to rise up and compete and contend and win the Sun Belt. Again, you mentioned like they have not won a Sun Belt at all under Sean Clark. And last year they play in the title game, but they only play in the title game because James Madison wasn't eligible to play in the title game. So I think that I need to see it from Sean Clark and from Appalachian State to feel truly confident. Offensively, again, you mentioned it with Joey Aguilar coming back. He was one of the best quarterbacks in the country that nobody really talked about all that much, and I include us in that. We probably should have talked about him a little bit more than we did. Look, they didn't have a workhorse at running back, but they had a great collection of guys who are going to be back, and also just the system I think really emphasizes really good running backs and trying to put them in good positions. So this is a team that I am excited about, but right now I probably would put them below Memphis as currently the bottom team on our list.
Yeah, I would too, only because I'm convinced the Sun Belt is the most likely conference to just beat itself up. I don't think there is a
I
team
think
there
so
that's
too.
going to climb out. And conference losses are absolutely going to matter when we're talking about the G5 candidates. Again, we can forgive a loss at Clemson. Liberty would be a tough one because that would just be like, because with the regard Liberty is at, if you lose to Liberty, they're going to get all the benefit of the doubt and they're going to take your shine. And they absolutely they have a tough schedule there where they're going to need to win everything except Clemson to potentially make it there, in my opinion. But moving on, let's kind of wrap up the first half of this with Tulane. And they're a tough one. Obviously, if Willie Fritz was still there, it would be a lot easier to talk about them. And not only is he not there, but Michael Pratt isn't there anymore either. So last season, they followed up that incredible Cotton Bowl season with 11-3 record, 8-0 in the ACC. Although, of course, they then lost the conference game, the title game, to SMU, and therefore gave Liberty their free pass to go and die to the Ducks. They lost at Ole Miss early on in the season, and then they lost their bowl game to Virginia Tech. And at that point, they were kind of in the lame duck period because Willie Fritz had already left. John Summerall, great coach, really did a wonderful job at Troy. I thought it was a great way to reload the program, and I know a lot of folks do. The transfer portal was not kind to them as well. They lost a couple of guys. They lost Chris Braswell to Tennessee. They have some guys coming in. Ty Thompson from Oregon. He'll be interesting to see if he can kind of make that work. They've got a Mario Williams from USC, Shaz Preston, another receiver from Bama. They have a great running back in Maki Hughes. They've got some good linebackers. Defense, we'll see where they kind of fall into that. Their schedule is, again, we've got a tough schedule here. They're non-conference. K-State's coming to town. We've already talked about what we think of Chris Kleiman's team. So, again, Tulane and UNLV are two teams you just have to love because their locations are awesome. So they can get P4 programs to want to come and visit them. especially UNLV finally got that. When UNLV moved in Allegiant, they finally took away the one reason no one wanted to visit them, which was Sam Boyd Stadium, which was not awful, but not a stadium as a P4 actually wanted to go and visit. And then they're following that K-State with a road game at Oklahoma, which a few seasons ago, some may remember, that was one of those games where people were like, oh, wow, look at Tulane. They nearly took out Oklahoma. And then the whole team just collapsed after that. It was beautiful to watch a team just come out, try to knock out a major team, and then they completely lose their way after that. We saw that years and years ago when Fresno State took on USC and nearly knocked them off, and then just Pat Hill's program just kind of went off a cliff after that. In conference, though, they've got a couple of tough games at home, so the reverse of Memphis. South Florida is going to be playing in Yulman Stadium, and so will Memphis. So, new head coach, still overall a good system that Willie Fritz built there. Where do we put the Green Wave?
A really good transfer class, absolutely, coming in. I mean, you mentioned some of the names. Mario Williams, that is a big-time addition. He's somebody who easily could have ended up at another power conference. Ty Thompson is a former, super-duper blue-chip quarterback who was supposed to be one of the guys at Oregon, and obviously Oregon has had just a ton of guys come through since then. And so I think this will be a great fit for him. And by the way, John Sumrall took over a program at Troy that was not doing so great. They actually, I believe, missed a bowl game the year before he came in. I believe they were 5-7. He went 23-4 in 2 seasons. Of course, won 2 Sun Belt titles. And actually, by the way, when we talk about Appalachian State, part of this is just like a power vacuum in the Sun Belt because John Sumrall left. So I love the hire. I think it's going to work. In fact, I had some of these exact phrases when I talked about Tulane's former coach taking over at Houston. I just think that when you talk about the playoff and you talk about not even maybe starting 1-2, but it would be a shock if they don't start 1-2. I don't know if you're able to fight back from that. I don't know if you're able to work your way back up because, again, let's just assume, right? I mean, maybe they can beat Kansas State. They did it a few years ago, by the way. But let's just assume that they lose to Kansas State. I see no scenario where they go on the road and beat Oklahoma, just in terms of that being a road game, in terms of them trying to gear themselves up for the SEC. And I don't think they're going to overlook that game as well. I don't think they have the schedule to make up for 2 losses because after that, they play Memphis in the final week of the season. They should get a good team, whether it's Memphis or another team in the conference championship game, maybe even a borderline top 30 to 35 team, which is solid. But the AAC is filled with a lot of mid these days, especially with the additions that they made a couple years ago. Just to run through it, and actually one other thing I'll mention, they go to Louisiana. That's actually a really good non-conference game too for them to build some credibility. But South Florida, okay, sure, fine. At UAB, Rice, at North Texas, at Charlotte, Temple, Navy. It's just I don't think they have the ability to just make up for everything, right? And SMU, by the way, ran into this issue last year as well. They ended up going and winning the AAC, but they had 2 early season losses to power conference opponents, and they were unable to jump Liberty at the last minute, right? So, and it's a similar deal. When you look at SMU's schedule last year with Charlotte, East Carolina, Temple, Tulsa, Rice, North Texas, Memphis, Navy, Tulane. It wasn't enough. They weren't able to overcome those losses to Oklahoma and TCU. So I think that Tulane might legitimately win the AAC. That would not surprise me all that much. I just think that when you start the year with 2 losses, and I think there's probably a 3rd loss in there somewhere, though maybe it's just a 3rd loss, which would be fantastic. I just don't think that they have the ability to overcome that. So I'm going to put them right now at the bottom of my list behind Appalachian State, but look, is it impossible that they beat Kansas State? I don't think it's impossible. Again, they did it a little while ago. And if you beat Kansas State and and take a 2nd loss, but you have, an Oklahoma, a 2nd loss, and then a win over Kansas State, I think you're fine with that. I think that would be enough to get you in if it's that sort of permutation of things. But if it's 2 losses to power conference teams and then worrying about another loss, that's where I just can't get there.
It is a tremendous difference for Tulane. I just have to say, like 10 years ago, we would have never had this kind of conversation where wouldn't it be nice if they only had 3 losses? We'd be like, what? That would be a miracle.
We'd be having this conversation not just for the playoff. We'd be having this conversation for like, oh, I don't know. I think Tulane can make a bowl game.
I know.
Maybe,
it would be just thrilling. We're going 6 wins as a triumph. I mean,
and that's why Willie Fritz deserves to be in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah. Well, and the funny thing is, though, I was just imagining, imagine if somehow if they open 3-0, John Summerall might be the head coach at Florida before the season's done. That's all I was thinking. Like, they would be too good. That would be a disaster for the Green Wave. It would be both good and bad. I was just imagining that, because then people would be like, see, we told you he was good, because we were starting to see, and we've talked about this in the past, and a lot of people have, how the coaching hierarchy has changed over time, where it seems like going from a low G5 or perceived low G5, like a Troy, you're not going to necessarily get that SEC job. You're probably going to go to a high G5 or maybe a low P4 possibly. But then, now that would be all anyone needs to go like, oh, he's actually really good. Let's take him. And, we'll see him leap to one of those prestige
Should have done it last year, man. They should have done it last year.
Well, luckily for Florida, we're going to probably, we'll see where they go. But, they may be looking pretty early on.
They'll have options.
Well, when we get back, we're going to be looking at 4 more teams who might be really, we're going to try and rank them and place them, the 4 more teams to be contenders from the G5 as we head into the 12-team playoff here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
So kind of looking at our next 4, again, these are teams who we think could potentially be the conference champion that is the 5th team, the 5th conference champion to fit into an automatic bid into the college football playoff. UTSA. Now, so much has been said about this. Jeff Traylor is just a phenomenal coach. In every level, like he's a coach's coach. Coaches love him. I remember it was the last season he shared the cover of Texas Football Monthly, which is a huge deal. And he knows how to recruit. He's endeared himself to San Antonio. So UTSA last season, 9-4, which is a little bit disappointing for them, I have to say. But they still managed to turn it around and have only 1 loss in the American. They were Frisco Bowl champions against Marshall. They lost some people to talent. Probably the biggest name was Trey Moore. Losing him to Texas, he was a good enough edge that the Longhorns wanted him and are ready to plug him right in. Frank Harris is no longer there. He couldn't be a quarterback forever, even in these new roles. So it'll be interesting to see how their offensive line rotation is going to be. Who's going to replace Frank Harris? They do have some experience with that Colorado transfer. I'm not sure if he's going to be the quarterback. Actually, I'm not even sure who's the quarterback that's going to be over there. They do have some solid backfield that should be able to produce for them. And some good defensive talent. Their non-conference schedule is interesting. I mean, I always love the UTSA schedule because I believe no team in America tries harder to schedule teams in state than the Roadrunners do. Although I love their opener. I totally believe they're going to win it, but they are the welcoming committee for Kennesaw State. That's their first FBS game. The Owls have now moved up and they've joined Conference USA to be one of the other challengers against Liberty. Then they go on the road to play Texas State. So that'll be a fun one because Texas State certainly, we'll probably talk about them in our next episode, but GJ Kinney's been doing some good work down there. And then they followed up at Texas. That'll be some tough games right there. And then they host Memphis. So UTSA is, again, one of those teams where I like the program. It's hard to doubt what Jeff Traylor's doing over there, but that schedule is such where I'm not sure. I don't know where to place them. I don't know if they have enough talent to put themselves as that G5 contender should they win the conference.
They're right on that line, I'd say, with Tulane. I'm leaning, I think, putting them under Tulane, but let's think for a minute. So when you talk about, of course, replacing Frank Harris, one of the best quarterbacks in the group of five for, I guess, the past 7 years, you can say at this point. But so they've got two players who they're really excited about competing for the quarterback job. That's Eddie Lee Marburger, who's actually he's like from the Valley. He's like from Brownsville
I was about to
level,
say San
the
Fernando.
Valley.
Sorry, no.
Yeah, not the San Fernando. No, he's so he's somebody that they're very excited about. And actually, the other name you mentioned, the transfer from Colorado, that would be Owen McCown, who, yes, one of those McCowns, who, by the way, Jeff Traylor actually coached the McCowns, Josh McCown, when he was actually a high school coach, and I believe it was Jacksonville High School. So they have a long-standing relationship with that family. And by the way, anybody who bought off the Colorado scrap heap, good for you. I know that you got some value because they did not sift through that thing whatsoever before they threw it out. But the other thing that you have to like too, they bring in a couple of big time transfers with like elite level pedigree. Kendrick Blackshear at linebacker coming in from Texas. Denver Harris, a cornerback who a lot has been said about over the years, and for good reason. But I think that that this is the perfect kind of situation for him to figure it out. He was at Texas A&M, kind of got pushed out. LSU basically got suspended for most of the season. This is a place, and this is a staff that I think will know how to, I don't want to use the words handle him, but I think we'll know how to support him in the best way possible to get the most out of him. Ian Jackson, a linebacker coming in from Alabama. So like they've got some big time players. Actually, Jalen Garth is an offensive tackle from Houston. I know he started his career at Texas as well. So I just like love the high end talent that they're bringing in to complement, by the way, what has been a pretty incredible run of high school recruiting. This year they only had 16 or 17 high school recruits, and they still finished top 75 in the country in high school recruiting. So like that's pretty impressive for what you are dealing with, obviously, as an AAC program. Now, I think that for me, this is a transition year. Now, it's a transition year that could be a 9-win season, but again, to get into this playoff conversation, I think you got to be at more like 11 or maybe 10 with a big victory, which I mean, they'd have to, like, Texas is the only that kind of victory that they could get to. And by the way, UTSA, that game against Texas State, that is a hell of a rivalry game. Those two programs hate each other. It's actually a rivalry that started in a lot of ways in other sports before UTSA fielded a football team, and it slowly started to move up. And Texas State is a very proud sub-FBS program. They won 2 D2 national championships back in the 1980s. So UTSA fans relish the fact that they have just made a football program out of nothing and already had more success than them at the FBS level. So this will be a heated game. Honestly, I mean, look, I don't know if CBS is going to allow me to travel down to UTSA Texas State, but like that's the kind of game that I'd love to make the pitch to go to and write about. So there's just a lot of chaos on this schedule. So I think I'm going to put them right now last on our list, but again, this is a very good 9-3 team, and when we talk about 2025, I think they're back right in the middle of the playoff mix.
Yeah, I think that is the interesting point, that there was some reloading here. Losing Frank Harris, it's one of those things where you're like, we'll just have to see who steps up, and if it's enough to maintain that. Because, yeah, again, that Texas game almost certainly is going to be penciled in as an L, but yeah, I'm not sure if they have what it takes to win it all. I do have to say, though, going back to that Texas State rivalry, like it's being played at Texas State, so this now makes me wonder. They should have like a pact where the losing coach jumps into that river, that they've done before at Texas State when they made the bowl, and then Kinney jumped in, and Dan Fizz, the president, jumped in. Like they should have that where like I don't know, the winner or the loser would jump in that particular case, but that would be a fun one. I don't know. I have never been to San Antonio, but I know it's near the Riverwalk. Like, could they then have the winner or loser of that game jump into the water in the Riverwalk?
You do not go in that water.
I'm not saying
that is not usable water. No. You don't go in that water. That is not safe water to touch with your body. Absolutely not. The thing about Texas State is that they're right on the Brazos River. And also, I believe it does go down through San Antonio. It's just not like right in the middle of town. So there's a way to get to the Brazos River that should be totally fine for you. But I'm down. I think that yeah, whoever wins the game should have to jump into the river. Whoever loses the game should be thrown into the river by their fans.
No, it's an alternating thing. It reverses. So in San Antonio, the loser actually has to jump into the river, walk water. Oh my goodness. Well, let's move on to the MAC. And again, I love these selections because we're talking about at least one team from all of the G5. So Toledo is a team we're going to talk about, although you could make an argument for another team we'll get to actually probably in our next episode. But so Toledo, I don't know what Jason Candle does to not get a new job, but he's been there for 9 seasons now, and no one has ever doubted his coaching acumen during that time. And this past season, 11-3, 8-0 in the MAC, but again, they lost the MAC title game. So we're talking about another team that could have potentially scooched past Liberty had they won their conference title game. I have to say Toledo might have been one of those because their only loss at that point was a close loss at Illinois to start the season. And then they lost a 1-point game to Wyoming in the Arizona Bowl. So their 3 losses were all accounted for. They would have been a 1-loss team. It would have been interesting to see them, but their transfers, obviously we've talked about DeQuan Finn. He's now he went to Baylor. We'll see where he lands there on the quarterback depth chart. Quinion Mitchell was excellent. And unfortunately, he was so excellent that he went to the NFL and was a first-round draft pick. They returned their top 3 receivers. They returned their leading rusher from 2022. They have an all-MAC safety in Maxon Hook. They have a non-conference game at Mississippi State. We'll see how they do. Again, the way the Toledo plays, that's the exact kind of P4 team they might take out on the road or might not. You never know. But their schedule isn't terrible in the conference. They host Miami, which is potentially the other major contender in their conference to win it all. And then they go on the road at NIU, which is always a tough program, and the Huskies should be a contender at least for the conference title this season. The MAC has historically made its way in the year 6. We've certainly seen it before with Western Michigan and with NIU. I'm not sure where we would put Toledo because, again, other than that game at Mississippi State, the schedule doesn't look terrible. Where do we put them?
They're such a tough team for me to evaluate because from an advantage perspective, they should be a team that wins the MAC just about every year. Like nobody else invests to the level that they do, has the resources that they do. And a lot of people ask me like, why does Jason Candle not get more looks for these high-end jobs, right? But it's because they've kind of just been trucking along okay. Now, last year was in some ways a breakout season for them. They won 11 games. They lost in the conference title game, whatever. It's not like the end of the world to lose in the conference title game in a competitive conference, but they won 11 games for the first time, by the way, since 2017. It had been that long at this program since they had won double-digit games. So maybe they're turning the corner. Maybe it's like coming back and happening again. Like 2022, they won the MAC for the first time since 2017. 2023, they win 11 games for the first time since 2017. So like I think that's kind of how you have to look at it, right? Is like, okay, maybe they're back on a growth trajectory. The tough piece is, like you mentioned, I mean, DeQuan Finn gone, that is a really tough loss for them. He was such a big part of what they did. They're 127th in returning offensive production, 103rd in returning defensive production. And by the way, like the playoff case for all these teams, like the question isn't whether UTSA is better than Liberty, because that doesn't actually matter. The question is, can they create their pathway to the college football playoff? But if you're talking about the quality of this team versus some of the others on the list, I mean, I would have them last, and I don't think I'd think all that hard about it. Like, I think that they probably are a worse team, just down play to play than what Liberty is right now, especially with how much they have to replace. I have them bottom of my list. I think that the MAC is so upwardly mobile that when you lose this much, I think somebody will just pop up and get you. You refer to, of course, Miami of Ohio being one who's done that historically. I think there are other contenders as well that we'll get to, like you mentioned, on our next episode. I just think that for them, they'd have to pull basically the Liberty, right? Like they'd have to essentially go 13-0 and everybody else, I think, including Liberty, by the way, would have to mess up at some point to feel especially confident that they're going to make the field. And I do think if they go on the road and beat Mississippi State, that helps. That helps, I think, get them more into the discussion if they go and play well against a legitimate SEC team. But if they lose that game and Mississippi State goes like 3-9 and they finish 12-1, I don't know who's going to be all that impressed by that.
Yeah, you're right. And they have a shot, obviously, because Jeff Levy's first season at Mississippi State. But that is a very tough. I mean, it's a tough strength of schedule. It's the MAC can be tough. And I think you made a really compelling argument about the reloading. And that's going to be a huge factor. I mean, I think first of all, if Jason Candle manages to win the MAC again with this team, I mean, it's just going to be another shocker that, like at this point, maybe an NFL team should poach him. I mean, like if these FBS teams don't want him, like fine, I don't know, but just build him a statue, make him a rocket man. Not sure, but yeah, it's a tough one to place. I think I would. I would put them a little higher only because of the potential that they could win out. I think they would have an easier time than UTSA or Tulane because those schedules are just, I think, much tougher. And they really have no shot. And I'd actually be debating about App State only because, again, I think the Sun Belt is such a more difficult conference to peg. But I can see how if the returning talent factor is an issue, they would drop to the bottom, and they do. I agree. I do agree that they're like a situation like Liberty, but without even the talent to rely on that Liberty has. I mean, putting those two teams up against each other, I would take Liberty hands down at this point.
So, okay, why don't we compromise? Okay, so we've ranked 7 teams so far. Our top 4, Boise State, Liberty, Memphis, App State. Our bottom 2 right now, Tulane, UTSA. Let's slot them right there at number 5. Let's put them ahead of Tulane and UTSA.
All right, I'm comfortable with that. I think they might slide up over App State, but I'm willing to negotiate to that point. That I can live with that. Let's move to another team. And again, I don't know how this has happened over time. Maybe I'm just fascinated by how the program has gone about building an on-campus stadium, which is, again, they've been deliberate. They're on the level. That stadium is coming. I'm fascinated. If it's not called the Bull Ring, I'll be very disappointed. But South Florida, the USF down in Tampa, they went 7-6 last season, which was a tremendous turnaround by Alex Golish and company. They went 4-4 in the conference. They won the Boca Raton Bowl by crushing Syracuse 45-0. Like Syracuse just doesn't want to talk about that. They got a new head coach. Everything's happy. They got good transfers. La-di-da, everything's great up in upstate New York. But they had a great signing class. They had the top ranked recruiting class outside of the Power 4. They returned 19 starters. Quarterback Byron Brown, if he can show some improvement, that'll be a major part of this. They have a 1,000-yard receiver in Sean Atkins. They've got their lead back on the field with Naquan Wright. They've got a good offensive line anchored by Zane Herring, and they've got a very good cornerback on that defense. Their non-conference schedule is awful. They go and play at Alabama. They host Miami, which, again, the benefit of they play not in the greatest situations, but it is an NFL stadium, and Miami will absolutely show up for that game. So that was a good call. Their conference schedule, they play at Tulane, so that'll be a tough one. And then they have a Friday night home game with Memphis. So their schedule is something where if they can potentially get some upsets, they can earn it. If they can win the conference, they'll certainly probably earn it. The question is, and maybe this is the SMU thing again from last season, it is tough to see how they could go to Alabama and win, and it is almost equally as tough to see with what we think of Miami and Florida is going to be, how that is going to match up. What do we make of the Bulls?
What is it like that hard to play Alabama? South Florida made it look pretty easy last year. I don't know what you're talking about.
And you got a coaching reset, so it isn't even like Nick Saban's angry going to coach against you. It's just
I don't know though. You have a coach that only wins 11 games at the power conference level. Not like this Nick Saban guy who had like a 9-win season once. But I think like I wanted to talk about this team, right? I wanted to talk about this team because they are so much fun. They are I have a lot of faith and a lot of optimism about what they can be under Alex Golesh. This has happened so much quicker than I expected that they've gotten back to relevance and competitiveness. But one, the schedule, like you mentioned, is just insane. Like it just I can't see how they can possibly survive the schedule. I don't know how they can even, like, with some of the teams that they even have in conference play. Like, it's going to be tough with at Tulane versus Memphis back to back to basically open conference play. So they're bottom of the list for me largely because of that. But Byron Brown is one of the, like, exciting, fun young quarterbacks in college football right now. I think he is going to be an absolute star in this sport. I'm thrilled, by the way, that he decided to come back. I mean, 3,300 yards, 26 touchdowns, and plus another 800 on the ground as a freshman. It is just crazy stuff. 11 rushing touchdowns as well. That's silly stuff. Like that is silly stuff. I really hope to even get past this season. I hope they're able to keep him long term because this is the kind of quarterback and kind of player in this system. This is the kind of situation where I'm like, okay, in 2026, they are going to be the first 12 seed to beat a 5 seed. Like that's the kind of situation, if they're able to keep this together, that we could be setting up here. I don't think it's this season. It wouldn't shock me if they got into the AAC discussion and contended for an AAC title this year. I think this could be a 10-3 type team. I don't think they can get all the way up to being in the college football playoff. And so for me, I'm actually going to even put them behind UTSA as currently my last team in 8th place.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you on that one, only because yeah, it's a tough schedule. I think I want to emphasize what you said. This is going to probably be a great team. I'm not saying it's going to be a terrible team by any shot, but I'm looking at their schedule and I'm like, eight wins is about as comfortable as I would feel giving them at this point. I mean, and more would be great. And I think they certainly could get to be a 10-win team. But I'm looking at I'm penciling in the Alabama and Miami games as losses. I'm penciling in probably they could easily lose both those Tulane and Memphis games. And I mean, that is a brutal, like those are almost entirely back to back, other with Southern Miss. A game at Southern Miss is going to be in the middle of it. Um, but it's still going to be a great step up. I think we're going to see improvement. I think again, we're just talking about that recruiting class. I mean, Alex Golesh is building something there. And we'll have to see, I think, more in the future. But they're an interesting team out there, and I'm glad we had a chance to talk about them. We can wrap up our discussion with a ninth team, Fresno State. Now, Fresno State, they are ever since Pat Hill kind of turned them around, they are always kind of in that conversation as that G5 team that could potentially have their year and they could break out. Last season went 9-4, but only 4-4 in the conference. They were New Mexico Bowl champs. They were spoiled the Cinderella season of New Mexico State. Now, Jeff Tedford, I'm very curious to see how he does. I'm actually, and this is off the field. I don't know, will he make it through the whole season? I'm very curious because he had heart issues when he was with the Buccaneers and he had heart surgery. Now, some people may remember he medically retired. It's interesting. It's his 6th season with Fresno State, but it hasn't been contiguous. And he loves Fresno State. He played there. He coached there, for the record. Like this is a team he actually genuinely has passion for. But he medically retired in 2019. Kalen DeBoer stepped in for a couple years, and then his career kind of took off. So he came back, and then right before the bowl game in December, well, not right before, but like at the beginning of December, he medically stepped away again. I actually was confused. I thought they were going to do a coaching search, but he ended up coming back. So he came back in the spring. They haven't been really saying what it was, but the assumption is it's related to his heart. I've seen this happen. It just makes. We've seen a couple of coaches, Jerry Kill famously has dealt with that his whole season. One of the great coaches, oh my gosh, the Coastal Carolina head coach, who's Joe Moglia, brilliant guy. And he was a guy who's so well off and just smart. If you ever talk to him, he's, by the way, one of the greatest coaching interviews in history. Like the guy is sharp as nails, having been the CEO of Ameritrade and all that stuff. But he just kind of said like, yeah, no, I'm going to be the general manager of the team. I'm not going to be the head coach. I just can't handle it anymore. He put his health first. So with Tedford, I'm just curious to see. So all that said, though, looking on the field, they're returning a lot of talent. They are a top 15 FBS offense in terms of returning productivity. They've got a solid quarterback with Mikey Keene. They've got a good running back with Malik Sherrod. They've got their best wide receiver back there with Jalen Moss. Most of the offensive line. The defense will be another story. They lost a lot of talent. They'll be trying to pull in some. They've got a couple of good transfers. And then we talk about that schedule. So their non-conference is they're going on the road to Michigan to open up the season. So we're going to get an interesting test on Sherrod Moore really fast. I'm not sure where I'm going to see how that game will go. I think that's Sherrod Moore. Really that's a big question is how good is Michigan going to be this season? I think that'll be a good test for both of these teams. They host Wazoo. They go on the road to UCLA at the end of the season, which I love that game only because Fresno State loves beating LA teams. USC and UCLA, anytime those teams say, first of all, like I know it says at UCLA, that is going to be packed with Fresno State fans. They are going to show up for that. Like the Valley makes that drive down there. Like I grew up in the Central Valley. I mean, some of you may know Fresno State has that green and red V on the back of their helmet for the Valley. So that'll be an interesting one to see. And their conference schedule, though, overall isn't terrible. The game that I circled on there is going to play at Air Force, which is a team we haven't really talked about a whole lot, but they miss Boise State. They also play Colorado State. It'll be interesting to see that. And they play at UNLV. I do want to acknowledge that as well. So Fresno State is one of the oddest teams for me to kind of set up. I think the one game I'm not willing to give them is at Michigan. But as we said, that isn't going to knock you out completely. I just don't know where to place them.
Yeah, well, just to circle back to one thing you said, the reason we're not talking about Air Force is because there are 134 teams that are returning in FBS. Yeah, and they are 134th in returning production. So dead last. That's why we're kind of waiting. I just have to say, with
Air Force, I'm willing to be a little bit more that it's a system. Like more than most teams, it's a system. But we have to see who shows up.
You gotta. I think that one of the things, though, is that especially at the quarterback position, like experience in the system, I think creates a ceiling, right? Like that's the thing that gets you to, we're going to win like 11 games. We're going to be like the best team in the Mountain West. And they'll get back to it. I just think that this is a transitionary year for them, especially at that position. Anyway, back to Fresno State. A lot to like. Logan Fife coming back. You mentioned some of those playmakers on offense. Overall, pretty highly ranked in a lot of returning production metrics. And a relatively manageable schedule. I think that, look, we obviously have Boise State really high, actually currently number 1 on our list of contenders from the group of 5. But like, I do think that there's going to be a team that stands up and contends with them. I absolutely do in the Mountain West. There are just too many good teams. And that could be Fresno State. I think that's absolutely possible. Something that I don't love, they lost their last 3 games of the 2023 season. They kind of like slowly slid down the hill in some ways. Now, part of that was Mikey Keene missed a couple of games, and so maybe you just write it off as being something like that. I also don't love the distraction of Jeff Tedford's health. Like that is something that I think that, and that's so unfair, right? That like let the man be sick and have to try to deal with his health. But like, when you talk about it from a football coaching perspective, it's like to not know day to day what's going to be there, who's going to be leading this program. Is he going to miss time later next year? Is he going to retire at some point during the season? I think it is a factor. Now, I will say, even with all that context, I still think this is going to be a very good team, a 9 or 10 win type team. Like this is a really good group of 5 here potentially, and I think the Mountain West is going to be a huge recipient of that after a pretty down year last year from the conference overall. I'm gonna slot them. So again, right now our top 3, we got Boise State, Liberty, Memphis. We got Appalachian State at 4, Toledo at 5, Tulane at 6, UTSA at 7, South Florida at 8. I'm going to slot them. I'm going to push App State down a spot. I'm going to put them at 4. I think that for me, they're like right on the App State line in some ways, but I think that they probably are the top team from the Mountain West that I would see as being able to play spoiler. You do have to point out, UNLV, again, they lost Jaden Mayava, but they are definitely a system and they bring back a lot of their good running backs. You think about, can Air Force replace what they lost? You think about some of the other teams that could get into the conversation. And by the way, like a total wild card with some of this is what happens with Wazoo and Oregon State and whether these teams end up being decent. It doesn't look like they're going to be, but like if they are, that kind of changes the Mountain West outlook for the worse in a lot of ways. But I think that Fresno State is probably the next team in line to make that happen.
I agree with that placement. Yeah, Fresno State's schedule, I think again, they can get away with the loss at Michigan, but they have an opportunity with the rest of this and that returning production to be and I think they're going to be a team that if they do become a contender, it's going to be midway through the season that people are going to suddenly notice them because they'll probably drop the opener. But I think if they can get past UNLV and Washington State, then I think folks are going to start noticing them as one of those potential contenders. But there's a lot of ifs there with all of these teams. So again, just to kind of rewind, as we've said, kind of again, ranking these 9 contenders by the likelihood of us thinking they could win enough, if not win out, and make it as the 5th CFP, probably the 5th conference champion to get in the CFP, most likely as the 12th seed. We have Boise State, Liberty, Memphis, Fresno State, Appalachian State, Toledo, Tulane, UTSA, and USF. And that's not to say that it's going to be one of those 9 necessarily. I think our next episode will talk about some potential spoilers even within these conferences. But I think it'll be interesting to see this. I like this list. I think hearing us talk it out, Boise State does, I think, have the best shot. That schedule, that talent level, especially if Malachi Nelson works out, they are really going to have an opportunity to make some noise, even with what we, again, are assuming will be a loss at Oregon, throwing it in there. But that's the wonderful thing. I mean, actually, the more we talk about each of these episodes, the more you love the 12-team playoff because there's opportunities for programs that historically just have not. And this is a great example of that. Well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up. This has been a long, flowing conversation. Lots to talk about. We always think, look, it'll go for 40 minutes. And the next thing we know, we're past 60. But before we wrap this up, I wanted to take a second to thank all of you who listened to us. I wanted to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at the CF. I always do that. At CFP Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can find his work at cbssports.com and at Shehan Jayaraja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Hayeri. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.